Our next phylum is Echinodermata, and this is a fun phylum. This consists of sea stars, sea cucumbers, sea urchins, sand dollars. You'll definitely recognize some characters in this phylum. There's about 6,000 known species, although there could be many more that are unknown. And this is an interesting characteristic of this phylum. As you've seen on our cladogram so far, we see bilateral symmetry pretty much consistently after cnidarians. So from that point onward, we see a lot of bilateral symmetry. Now, echinoderms have what are called pentamerous or five-way radial symmetry. However, they actually evolved from a bilaterally symmetrical ancestor, and their larval forms, so when they're larvae, they have bilateral symmetry. So these guys are kind of an interesting exception on the cladogram with respect to symmetry, but keep in mind that as larvae, as juveniles, they have truly bilateral symmetry. So some other characteristics that make up this phylum, they have kind of an endoskeleton. So even though they may feel hard and spiny on the outside, in fact, their name actually means spiny skin, Echinodermata, um, they have reinforced little calcium carbonate plates under their skin, and they're called ossicles, and they're basically like little discs that give them some rigidity and some protection, and it's underneath the kind of rough spiny skin that these guys tend to have. Those little spines on their skin actually usually have tiny little pinchers called pedicelaria, and I'll show you a picture of these in a moment. They're kind of interesting. Um, Echinoderms move and are able to hold their body in place and have the body rigidity because of a water vascular system. So basically, they pump water in, and water pressure gives them sort of firmness or softness, depending. And something else that's cool about this phylum is they typically can regenerate legs if removed. So a sea star loses a leg, it can grow it back usually. So we'll look at the classes within this phylum. The first class are called Asteroidea, and this is the class consisting of sea stars. Marine scientists typically don't call them starfish only because they're not actually a fish. So just kind of a fun little terminology thing there, although we tend to call them sea stars. Um, they tend to be more widely known as starfish. So members of Asteroidea, sea stars, have a central disk and then 5 arms or rays, although some members can have more than 5. Basically, there's 2 sides to a sea star's body, the dorsal side, which is the top or the back, and the ventral side, which is underneath. Now, in this case, we call it the oral surface and the aboral surface. So the oral surface is the underside, the ventral side, and the aboral, or the surface opposite the mouth, is the dorsal. It's the top side. So just a little bit of orientation there. You can look over some of the body parts here. They have a central ring. Now this is their water vascular system. They have a central ring here in the center, and then these rays that extend out into each of the arms. And so what happens is when sea stars need to make their body really stiff and rigid, they take in water, and water comes in through a little pore called the madreporite. It's this little tiny hole right here, and it's pretty easy to find on most sea stars. Water goes in through the madreporite and then enters the ring canal, which is this first little ring here. From there, it goes out into the radial canals and into these little tiny bubbles, which are called ampulla, or ampullae is the plural. And these little bubbles are connected to the tube feet. And so when a starfish tries to move, it basically is inflating those little bubbles with water so that they can reach and stretch and move about. So that's kind of the basics of the water vascular system. In through the madreporite, ring canal, radial canals, ampullae. So again, this helps it to move and gives it some structural rigidity when needed. So when they feed, starfish in particular, these are, you can see here, these are the little tube feet. They will extend their tube feet out and pry open shells like this mussel here and other types of mollusks. And so they can pry, those feet are actually extremely strong. They can pry apart bivalves pretty easily. But then something else they do that's pretty remarkable, they actually stick their stomach out and engulf the prey and basically start digesting it from the outside. And so it extends its stomach, wraps its stomach around the prey, and then starts secreting enzymes to break down and dissolve the tissue. So some things about reproduction. Again, they can actually regenerate missing arms, but that's only if the central disc is still intact. So if that central disc is intact, they could lose all 5 arms and regrow all of them. Although that's not really how they reproduce sexually. They have separate genders, and egg and sperm are shed into the water column for fertilization. So this picture shows you some stages here of fertilization. Here is a little tiny blastula. So this is a ball of cells that's dividing, and eventually it becomes a gastrula when the internal body cavity forms. And those steps are true of pretty much all animals. Blastula, gastrula, a blastopore forms, and eventually you have a larvae. So this is what a sea star larvae looks like. So again, it has bilateral symmetry. You can see it here, the process. So female, male, they release their gametes. This is what the larvae could look like. And then eventually it will grow into this pentamerous radial symmetry that it has as an adult. The next class we'll look at, this is class Ophiroidea. This is brittle stars, basket stars. This is the most numerous of echinoderm species. There's more of these guys than any other echinoderms. They have really spindly arms. They almost look like worms, these arms that come out of their central disc. These guys have no pedicelaria, so their tube feet do not have suckers. So these guys do not suck onto and stay stuck onto rocks the way that sea stars can. They tend to avoid light, so these guys tend to be bottom dwellers, even burrowers. They may burrow in sediment. We find them anywhere from the intertidal into the deep sea. These guys tend to be suspension feeders, so what they'll do, instead of being sort of aggressive predators the way a sea star is, brittle stars actually can weave a little web of mucus to filter feed with, which is pretty cool. This is a basket star. This is pretty amazing. These guys can actually, in addition to suspension or filter feeding, they can grab large prey with their arms, and they've got little hooks on the end. So there's a crab that's fighting off a big basket star. It's pretty cool. These guys, unlike the sea stars, these guys sometimes can be hermaphroditic, or they can be separate gender, so it just depends. Sometimes they'll brood eggs in the body cavity, so that's a big difference between them and the sea stars. The next class are echinoids, class Echinoidea. So this is sea urchins, sand dollars, and heart urchins. These guys have an exoskeleton, so their hard part is on the outside rather than underneath a layer of skin. They're benthic, so these guys are definitely bottom dwellers, and there's sort of 2 categories of them. There's what we call regular echinoids, so these are sea urchins. They're kind of spherical in shape, and they still have 5-way radial symmetry. If you look at them from the top, you would see the 5 rays coming out. It's just almost like you take a sea star and puff it up and take away its arms, and you would have an urchin. So urchins would be considered regular echinoids. Irregular echinoids would be sand dollars, heart urchins, and these guys actually have bilateral symmetry. So these are truly bilaterally symmetrical. So here's a sand dollar, and you could divide a line straight down through the middle like this, and you would have bilateral symmetry on each side. Now, when you might have a remnant of a sea urchin maybe in your bathroom or in a collection at home, and it's this white disc. But when they're alive, they actually have a little fuzzy layer of skin covering their body. So these guys, when they're alive, they feel really kind of fuzzy, a little bit harsh to touch even. And on their underside is their mouth, their oral surface. So they look a little different when they're alive compared to when they're dead. So the body type of echinoids, here's a regular urchin, for an example. Their mouth is on the on the oral surface, which is the underside, and then the aboral surface is the top. They have the spines. Spines can actually move, so these guys, if you watch them, they can move their spines, and they have little tube feet extending all across their body. So sometimes they're venomous, but usually not, although those spines do certainly hurt if you ever step on one. What's neat about these guys is their mouthpiece is this little kind of a upside down lantern piece. In fact, they call it Aristotle's lantern, and it's almost like a little beak. And they tend to be grazing. So urchins are actually well known as being grazers, they will eat huge volumes of algae and kelp. In fact, they've been known to basically take out entire kelp forests just by eating them and eating the base of them. So urchins are pretty big part of the ecosystem for that reason. Our next class are called Holothuridia, and this is the class of sea cucumbers. These guys have long, soft bodies, so they do not have spiny, hard bodies. Sea cucumbers, if you've ever handled them, are kind of funky to handle. They're very soft and squishy, anywhere from 3 centimeters to 1 meter long, so they can be really big in certain cases. These guys, believe it or not, also have that 5-way symmetry. If you were to look at them from the front, you would see these rows and rows of tube feet there's 5 of them, and it almost has a star-like shape when you look at it from the front. So they're kind of like a very, very elongated sea star that's soft. These guys undergo gas exchange. They have these respiratory trees that they stick out. So these are typically kept on the inside of the body cavity, but they can extend them for gas exchange. They're separate genders, so male and females are separate, and they will fertilize and larvae develop in the water. They also have oral tentacles that tend to surround around their mouth as well. And one of the most notorious things about sea cucumbers is they will actually spit out their guts at predators. So they will eviscerate their entire insides as a way of self-defense, so that the predators then go after the guts instead of going after the sea cucumber. And then the sea cucumber has to regrow its body parts. So it definitely comes at an energy cost. So it doesn't do that very easily, but it's kind of a last resort if it feels threatened. But one of the other things it'll do, this is something it'll do before it eviscerates its guts, is they can release these stuff called tubules. It looks kind of like silly string, and it actually kind of poops it out through its anus. And so this stuff will get stuck on the predator and will, again, distract the predator enough so that the sea cucumber can make a pretty gradual and slow getaway. And the last class are crinoids, and these are kind of a lesser known type of echinoderm. Class Crinoidea. Crinoids are feather lilies or sea lilies. They look almost plant-like, but they're not. They are truly an animal. So these guys attach on to rocks and all kinds of substrates on the bottom. So they have very strong attachment points here. They have what's called a stem or a column with a holdfast, just like a type of algae or kelp might. But again, it's truly an animal. And so these guys have a sort of a feathering, flowery looking filter feeding system. And so these are basically its arms with tiny little tube feet on them. And they can filter feed this way and take food in through the mouth, which is right about here in the middle. So amazing to look at. They're beautiful. They're fragile. Sometimes they're very small. And we've seen them in the fossil record for a long time. So these guys have been around for a very, very long time. All right, so that pretty much summarizes our echinoderms. So you'll also be moving on to chordates this week. And off to the right side of the screen, I'll move this over here, you can see a little summary of the basics about each of the classes within the phylum and just a couple characteristics you'll want to know about the phylum itself. And don't forget, you have a virtual urchin anatomy interactive to check out, and so that will be, there it is right there. That will be fun as well, and there's a quiz that goes along with it. All right, enjoy.